Hello everyone. In this tutorial we are going to be looking at creating basic eyes in 3ds Max, ZBrush and Photoshop. Now if for whatever reason you don't have all of these packages, then don't worry, you can still use the schematics of this process as a starting point. So essentially our eye is going to consist of two spheres. One sphere is for the iris, pupil and sclera. This is the part of your eye that holds all of the nice colours. And the other sphere is for the cornea, which is the larger transparent shiny shell surface that surrounds your eyeball. Okay, let's go ahead and create a sphere. I'm going to give it 24 segments. I'm not going to worry about its size for the moment. I'll be changing that to fit my character's eye socket. And I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees so that its central point is facing the front of the scene like so. Alright, now this is going to be the part of the eye that holds the colour, this central part. So this central point will become the pupil. I'm going to rename this sphere eye. And I'm going to unwrap it using the planar projection methods like so. Now as you can see, I've put a seam down the middle of this sphere, and I'm just going to break that apart. So I've got these two UVs like so. Now with PBR texturing, this seam doesn't really matter, but more importantly, you will most likely never see this part of the eye during movement anyway. I'm going to make sure that these UVs are relaxed and they're giving me a nice and even checker pattern across my model. Alright, now that I've unwrapped this sphere, I'm going to collapse my unwrap and press yes. I'll now duplicate this sphere to create the outer shell of the eye called the cornea. Now I'm just doing this by holding down Shift and scaling. I'll rename it cornea. Now I need to adjust the shape of both of these spheres slightly. So I'm going to temporarily make the cornea transparent by going to the object properties and clicking see-through. So make sure both of these shapes are converted to editable poly. Then just push in where the coloured part of the eye is on the inner sphere. And in contrast, you also want to do the opposite with the larger outer sphere. So just bulge out that area of the cornea like so. Alright. Now I'm going to select the cornea's UVs and move them so they are not overlaying the eye's UVs. Whilst we're in the UV area, I'd advise relaxing those UVs once again, seeing as you've made some adjustments that will ultimately affect the faces of the model. We don't want to be painting the same texture on both of them. As I say, one is for colour and the other is for transparency. Excellent. Now, before I export this out for texturing, I'm going to move both of these shapes into the eye socket of my character like so. Now I'm going to select all of my character's models up until this point, and I'm going to apply UVW unwrap over the lot of them, and I'm going to place the eye and the cornea UVs within that texture space. For this assignment we're just using one 4096 texture area, so I'm going to make sure that they fit into a nice place within that. You can apply a symmetry modifier here if you want to see how things look with both of the eyes in place, but you don't have to. And obviously you don't have to have a character to complete this tutorial either, I just think it's useful. So if you are lining this up to your character, before you go ahead and commit, just have a think about where the pupil will be. If you're like me, then you probably don't want your character to be cross-eyed, so make sure you're happy with it before you export it out as an object file. And you don't need to export the cornea because, as I say, that's going to hold no color detail. We're not going to sculpt or color that in ZBrush at all, so just leave the cornea be and export the eye object file. Okay, we are now ready to begin our texturing process. So there are of course multiple ways you can do this. Now I like to start with a rough color texture first in Photoshop. I'm going to make a 2048 by 2048 document and mix up some photo bashing and digital painting methods to complete this part. So this is just the draft texture. This isn't directly what's going to go on my UVs. This is just a bit of a prerequisite texture to what we're going to do in ZBrush. Now, I like to make my own textures from scratch and not rely on other people's. I think it creates a better learning curve. So the aim ultimately is to get the iris and the pupil in the center of this area, with the sclera color, that's the white part of your eye, surrounding the outside. Now you want to keep the lighting quite symmetrical for this part and avoid placing any reflective highlights. That will of course be accomplished later on by adding specular and gloss maps to the outer cornea. Now, I like to use a primitive circle shape as a guide to help me stay within the center of the canvas. I'm just going to do a bit of a time lapse here for you guys. It doesn't matter too much how you complete this part of the process, it's up to you. Okay, that is good enough for this stage. Don't have to spend too long on that. So once you've done that, save this out as a PNG or a Targa, and let's head over to ZBrush. So at this point, I will say if you are completely new to ZBrush, then please watch my basic sculpting videos first. So let's import those eyes and append them to our character sculpt. Once again, you don't have to append them to your character sculpt, you can do them separately, but obviously it does make it a lot easier to see where they're going to end up. Now, once you've got them in place, you're going to want to subdivide them several times so that you have enough information to sculpt and polypaint onto. So I'm going to subdivide those up. Now, before you go ahead and sculpt and paint any of your detail, I do recommend going down to UV map and checking that you actually do have UVs on your model. If for whatever reason you don't, then obviously you need to go back to 3ds Max and check that your unwrap is there and you have collapsed it correctly before exporting. We're now going to apply the texture we just made in Photoshop. With the standard brush selected, I want you to change the stroke to drag rect, make sure that Z add is turned off and RGB is turned on, and you want to also drag the focal shift down to -100. Once you've done that, you're ready to import your texture. I'll select the texture from the panel like so, and you simply drag it out over your model. Now, if this comes out pixelated, odds are that you don't have enough geometry, so please pay attention to what subdivision I went up to earlier on. We want the pupil of this texture to line up perfectly with the central points of the sphere, so don't be afraid to be meticulous of that. I also like to see how it lines up with my character sculpt. Alright, I'd say I'm now ready to start polypainting and sculpting in those finer details. So there are multiple methods of doing this, and it is mostly down to your artistic merit. The key things to try and accomplish here is to push the pupil deep into the eye and to generate bump variations within the iris. Another benefit of doing this within the eye sockets, my character sculpt, is that all of the reddish tissue that surrounds the sclera I can paint in and see how it perfectly lines up with those eyelids. With the damn standard brush, I like to polypaint and sculpt at the same time. Now this is really useful for those details within the eye. It's also very good for creating some of the veins coming out around the sclera. Now, if you're painting on a single eyeball, then you can take advantage of using radial symmetry, which will allow you to paint multiple edges of the eye at the same time. However, for this tutorial, I'm sticking to the simple X symmetry, seeing as I'm painting both of my eyes simultaneously. Okay, so once you're happy with both your sculpt and your polypainting detail, you'll want to export the maps out. So to export the diffuse map, go down to texture map, create new from polypaint, clone the texture, and then go up to texture, flip V, this flips it vertically, and then export it out as the file type you want it to go out as. And then we're pretty much going to do the same with the normal map, except when you do the normal map, you need to be on the lowest subdivision, and you're going to go down to normal map, make sure flip G is on, create normal map, clone it, flip it, export it. Excellent. So once you've done that, you want to apply it onto the eye of what you created in 3ds Max earlier. Okay, so all that's left to do now is the cornea. We're going to do this in Photoshop. So the first thing I need to do is to render out this UVW template of where the cornea is. That way I know exactly where to paint over. So we're just going to render out that UVW template like so. And we're going to drag and drop it into our Photoshop document. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to create an opacity map in Photoshop. So that diffuse texture that we exported out, just copy it onto a new layer and with the magic eraser tool, I want you to delete the black background. Now that that's done, we can quite easily create an opacity map. I'm going to hit Ctrl J to create yet another layer, and on this layer I'm just going to take the lightness up to the maximum. So just press Ctrl U and just take the lightness up to 100. Now we need to cover up where the cornea is. I'm going to use the same circle texture from the opacity of the eye and just drag it over. What I also want to do is make the edge around the iris slightly darker, but then make it slightly lighter again around where the pupil is going to be, like so. So as you can see, the cornea is mostly transparent, but it is slightly opaque just where we need that highlight to bounce off on. Okay, once we've done that, the first thing we need to do is to take it back into Max and test it out, make sure that's working correctly. Now, if you remember from earlier, we did change the visibility of that object down to see-through, didn't we? So we need to make sure that that's unticked under Object Properties, and obviously apply the opacity map in our material editor. Okay, now all we need to do is to apply a gloss map and a specular map. Now we can use the RGB data that we just created for the cornea to do most of the work here. We're just going to fill it in completely, so it's a solid color. It doesn't go any more transparent around the center of the eye. Now, what I'd advise doing is having the gloss for the cornea as a slightly darker tone than the specular map. So go with a quite light grey for the gloss, and then a completely white tone for the specular. Once you've done that, you want to punch them both out as target files and bring them into your material editor. Okay, so just make sure they are in the relevant slots, i.e. specular level, glossiness and opacity. Make sure that you are on high quality and you're viewing the materials in the scene as realistic materials with maps. And that is pretty much it for this process. You can keep playing about with your diffuse color and those other maps I've just shown you until you get the desired result. There are, of course, other maps that you can add. You can add reflective maps. There's all kinds of other ray trace options within 3ds Max as well if you want to go ahead and explore it. But as I say, this is just a basic eye tutorial. Okay, so that about wraps it up for this tutorial. I've just finished up these eyes. So as you can see, I've done a bit more experimenting with them, but I haven't done anything differently to what I've shown you. I've just used the diffuse map, an opacity, a gloss, and a specular. I have also gone ahead and added hair to my character. If you want to find out how to do that, then feel free to go ahead and watch my other video. But for this tutorial, that's pretty much it. So post your questions below. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time.